Do 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 do. Waiting on Todd to get here. Waiting on Todd to get here. Waiting on Todd to get here. So we're just waiting for Todd to get here. I know my voice sounds a little weird, so I'm gonna have to figure out what's going on with that. Um, welcome, everybody. We are hanging out for a little bit tonight. We're gonna talk about something that's really serious. It involves some current events, things that are happening in the world. But I thought it would be very important for those of us who are, students of the world. I know it's a little crazy, and sometimes the news can be overwhelming. So I wanted to have my friend Todd come on and kind of explain what's going on in Ukraine and how it affects us as United States citizens, things that we can do to help and kind of unpack and try to make sense of all the crazy things that are going on in the world. So as soon as he gets on, we definitely will get started. I am sending this out to people, so give me just a few seconds while we get this set up and Todd gets in. Let me send him a message really quick. Email sent. Okay. Then let us also take a look at and this is also a place where, like, if you have questions or things like that that you want to ask, now is the time to ask it, because we want to make sure that we are really kind of giving as much information as possible, explaining things, to give you guys a little bit of an idea of what we're doing and what we're discussing, or the bona fides that Todd has. First things first, he is a reporter. He's a journalist, so he has some insight and based on conversations he's had with other people to. Okay, it says it's still waiting. Did I spell it wrong? Let me see. Cigars on ice. Cigars on ice. So before we get started, y'all, I watched that crazy Medea movie. That movie was the fool. Oh, it didn't actually send. There we go. We watched that crazy Medea movie. It was good, but we'll get to that later on. We'll deal with that, talk about that on the Cousins tomorrow. So be ready at 5 o'clock Central Standard Time for the Cousins, and we'll discuss that. Hello, welcome to the stream. Come on in and get seated. We're going to have a good old conversation about what's happening with Ukraine as soon as Todd gets on. This is a Kansas City Alternative Podcast Collective special report. What the hell is going on in Ukraine? Hello, hello. We have Todd in the building.
Jayson.
Doo-ba-doo-doo-boo.
That's my Julia Child's voice.
Ah, you know, we all need a Julia Child voice. Hi,
Julia
friend.
Child. Hey, how are you?
I'm pretty good. Can't complain one bit, I wanted to talk to you about this because I thought, who do I know that would know things? Um,
You picked the wrong dude.
Come on now. Come on now. So let's just jump into this really quick. Anybody who has been uh, paying attention to the news knows that there is a crisis going on in Ukraine. Uh,
Uh, I mean, it's an active. It's the biggest war in Europe since World War II. I mean, that's
yeah,
what it is.
and I thought it would be a good idea to kind of unpack a lot of what's happening over there as much as we can, and kind of get understanding of what's because there's a lot of miscommunication. There's a lot of propaganda in the news about what's going on and what's happening. And I thought, who do I know that could kind of wade through all that muck and give us hard facts, what's going on, what we need to know, as citizens of the world, and how does this look? Because it's even today. Got up this morning and I was reading like there's the Russian Prime Minister Vladimir Putin has alerted his nuclear team, and it's like this is escalating really really fast. So let's kind of take a really like a deep dive in and just give us the basics on what's going on. I mean, other than just it's war.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, last Thursday, Putin decided to move his forces in and invade. And look, this is not the first time he has done this to a country that's part of the United Nations. It's not even the first time he's done it to Ukraine. He did it to Georgia in 2008. Under the same pretext, there were some separatist regions of Georgia that are pro-Russia, and he made some unsubstantiated claims about mistreatment by the government, genocide, things like that, and then they went in there. They still control those territories of Georgia. And around about 6 years later, they went and claimed Crimea. It's so Vladimir Putin has an irredentist view of Belarus and the Ukraine, and also parts of Georgia, which is to say that he believes that they are by right Russian, and that they allowing them to become independent when the Soviet Union broke up was a mistake and should not have happened. He believes because they are all those are all Slavic countries, or at least Slavic regions. Georgia itself is not Slavic, but the ethnic minorities in some of those parts are. And so he believes falsely that they have a shared history, shared identity, and that they are in fact Russian in everything but name. And so when he sees Ukraine, which is a constitutional republic, and it has its flaws. I mean, they've only been independent since 1991, and there's been lots of election meddling and lots of contested elections, things like that. But Ukraine has always been its own people. They have their own language. I mean, they've always been separate and distinct in some respects. Now, the area that he declared, a day or two before going to war, that he recognized as kind of separate countries, the Luhansk and the Donetsk region, which are part of an area of the Ukraine called the Donbas. Those areas are areas where they're ethnically Russian, and so he claimed, again falsely, that the Ukrainian government was partaking in genocide, was ethnically cleansing the ethnic Russians in that region. It's not true, and he should know this because They were already in there back in 2014 as part of when they annexed Crimea, which is a peninsula to the south of the Ukraine that juts into the Black Sea, and historically had been part of the Soviet Union. And again, he considers that part of Russia, even though it's always technically been part of Ukraine. But again, he feels like Ukraine is actually Russia. So part of the issue is when you have a successful constitutional republic where they can freely and fairly elect leaders every few years and have peaceful transitions of power, which obviously is a hallmark to most constitutional republics and democracies, because that's usually how those systems are set up. When you have that, and if that country, which, I mean, they are Slavic, a lot, people in Ukraine and Russia, it's not uncommon for Ukrainians and Russians to be married, to have family, to have friends who live in both countries. I mean, it's kind of like the US and Canada in a sense. I mean, they're not the same, but they're not so different, that they're unrecognizable to one another. I mean, I think most Canadians and most US citizens have a lot more in common than they don't have in common, right? But that's not to say that they have a common identity, but they have a lot of commonalities.
They have shared identities.
Right. Yeah. It's similar situation to Russia and Ukraine. That's probably the best way for the U.S. audience to understand that kind of relationship. But if you have a country there that is democratic, that is more prosperous economically, that seems to have more freedom, a place where the children have more hope, then that to Vladimir Putin is an existential threat to his regime. Because if the Russian people see that and see a thriving Ukraine and start to ask questions about, why can't we have this, or why can't we have that? Why don't we have free and fair elections? Those are just not questions that Vladimir Putin wants the 140 million or whatever people in Russia necessarily asking.
Right.
And so there's that. So basically he basically ran on his own version of MAGA. In this case, it would be Marfa.
Make Russia great again.
Yeah, MRFA, make the Russian Federation great again. So what? Yeah, MRFGA, whatever. But basically, he yearns for the 1970s Soviet Union, right? He wants a time when Russia was a dominant superpower, and that's not to say that he can, should, or will, or is even capable of restoring the full breadth of the Soviet Union. He's not.
Right. I was like, it's not possible at this point.
No, I mean, most of those countries, when you talk about, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, some of those countries, they have pretty substantial Muslim populations who are not going to tolerate Russian occupation at this point. Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, collectively known as the Baltic states, were admitted to NATO in 2004. So he can't really try to annex them. If he were to send Russian soldiers there, then it would automatically trigger the rest of NATO to go to war with Russia at that point. So that would be Germany, France, the UK, the rest of Europe,
right?
Plus the United States and Canada. I mean, he's not going to do that, unless, and we can talk about this down the road, like what could push this to get far worse before it gets better. And there is a scenario there, but sticking just basically to the Ukraine. He does not want these other major Slavic countries, Belarus and Ukraine in particular, to drift from Russia's sphere of influence.
Okay.
And Ukraine has kicked around the idea of joining the European Union, which is basically the economic equivalent of NATO without, the North American, without Canada and the U.S. in it. Although certainly they have trade agreements, but the EU is basically NATO minus the U.S. and Canada, and it's from an economic standpoint in terms of trade barriers and things there. Russia doesn't want that. Russia certainly doesn't want them to be allowed into NATO, which again would limit his ability to, wage war like he is now. to be clear, European Union membership is more possible. I honestly don't think it was highly likely until the last week. I think every day that Russia continues to attack the Ukraine, the likelihood that Europe, the rest of Europe, is going to say, yeah, we'll take them in the EU, grows. NATO, I mean, honestly, after they invaded Crimea, NATO wasn't even an option because, I mean, every other country that's joined NATO has had to settle their border disputes before they were allowed in. And with Crimea being occupied and that being an active border dispute, they aren't even eligible for membership as long as Russia's there. But I mean, what he wants. So basically, Alexander Lukashenko, who's the president of Belarus, does not want to leave power. He in fact calls himself the last dictator in Europe. He's proud of it. But to keep himself in power, he has basically cowed to the Russians.
Right.
He relies on Vladimir Putin to remain in power. Vladimir Putin has poisoned and killed his adversaries to keep him in power. Lukashenko is basically a puppet of the Kremlin. And that's why you see Russian forces staging in Belarus and not a whole lot's being done about it. That's why you also are starting to see, the NATO forces and even Japan and other NATO allies starting to impose some sanctions on Belarus to try to increase the pressure and stop letting them shoot rockets from Belarus and things like that, right?
Right. So I actually have another question about Belarus because I think Belarus is a very important part of...
Well, let me make one more point.
Go ahead.
What he wants, ultimately, the main objective that I think he wants is not to try to occupy the Ukraine, because there's 45 million people there. That's a very difficult proposition, especially he doesn't have the military to do it. And frankly, he doesn't have the military to launch a full-out assault on NATO right now. What he wants is regime change. He wants to catch Zelensky and anyone else who could lead a popular uprising, or who could lead a resistance, and I don't think Vladimir Putin particularly cares whether he kills, imprisons, or exiles these people. He just wants them gone so that he can install a puppet government similar to what Belarus has, have his own, the Ukrainian equivalent of Lukashenko, and then he will be able to keep, that power over the Ukraine, over the Belarus, and kind of keep that power block intact. I think ultimately that's what he wants right now.
Okay, also, because I think I look at it in terms of geopolitical power, and one of the big things that I saw coming up in this was this idea of they were doing peace talks today in Belarus. And my first thought was, why would you do peace talks in Belarus? That's how you get poisoned. But the other thing is that it's also that control of the Black Sea.
Well, that raises some other interesting questions though, because now you get Turkey involved, and Turkey's no joke. And Turkey has a lot to say over the Black Sea. Now they've got some treaties in place, but they don't. Turkey has a complicated relationship with Russia, and I promise you this: Turkey doesn't want Russia to dominate the Black Sea. They like the Ukraine. The major port there is Odessa on the southern, outside of Crimea. They don't want Russia to control the Black Sea on its own. That is absolutely not something Turkey will stand for. Now, what Turkey can say publicly and what they're willing to do may be different. But again, Turkey is a member of NATO. They're maybe not the most dedicated or the most loyal, and they certainly aren't one to go along with the rest of the rest of NATO. But they will stand up to Russia. And look, Ukraine's going to get help. I mean, there's reports today that the EU is going to loan 70 Russian-made fighter jets to to Ukraine to fight this battle. Now, NATO can't send their own pilots, but they all use old Russian hardware. So, a MiG-28 in Ukraine is the same as a MiG-28 in Poland. And I promise you, whatever the Ukraine wants, if Poland has it, Poland will give it to them.
Yeah, I've actually heard a lot about like Poland being a very strong ally at this point. Because they're like, we see what this is.
Poland. Look. World War II started when Germany invaded Poland, and then Russia invaded from the other side, and they agreed to split it up, and then everything kind of went from there. Poland does not want to be caught in this situation, and they will do everything they can to support the Ukraine in this fight, because if any people understand what being the center of a major conflict involving superpower, it's Poland. They get it.
Right.
Those people have a long memory, and they will absolutely help the Ukraine. Now, again, they can't send troops, and they can't actually, like one of the reasons they can't have a no-fly zone is because who's going to enforce that, right? And it would have to be NATO forces that would be patrolling the skies and enforcing it. The minute NATO planes fly over the Ukraine, the minute NATO troops, their boots hit the ground, that's it. That's it.
So
all options are now on the table for Putin if and when that happens.
Which
is why Biden has made it clear from the beginning, we will not send troops. We will not fight this war for the Ukraine. We'll do everything else. We'll give you weapons. We'll share intelligence. We will advocate for you. They have put together an incredibly strong coalition and an unprecedented number of sanctions that are going to absolutely decimate the Russian economy. And to be clear, some sanctions were put in place in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea.
So
those sanctions it took about 2 years for those sanctions to take some measure of effect. So that was about 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
But the Russian economy really has stagnated the last 6 years. The Russian economy is already, it's not grinding to a halt, but it's not growing. And these sanctions are going to cripple that. The ruble's already crumbled. They've already run out of hard currency, whether it's euros or dollars that people were trying to cash in as a hedge against the crumbling ruble. They just don't have it. You're seeing runs on banks. Unfortunately, sanctions are a blunt instrument. It's fair to ask whether this is a just and ethical response by the Western world, because it's not Vladimir Putin who is going to bear the brunt of these sanctions. It's the Russian people.
It's going to be the people, and then they're going to look at, and then it becomes incumbent on Vladimir Putin to say, hey, look what the West is doing to you guys.
And so then the question becomes, do the Russian people see through that? The reality is, I don't know. I can't put a percentage on it, but I don't think Russians want this war.
No.
Like I said, those are their friends and family. If Trump had gotten mad at Justin Trudeau and tweeted that we were going to war in Canada, I do not think the vast majority of Americans would have supported that war. And fortunately, in our case, I think Congress would have stopped him and been like, "What are you doing?"
Right. Maybe. Maybe.
Checks and depending on who was leading Congress at the time. But Mitch McConnell's not going to allow that to happen. You can think whatever you want about Mitch McConnell, but he's not allowing us to go to war with Canada, if only because the oil companies that prop him and every other politician, Democrat and Republican, up, understand that the most of our oil imports actually come from Canada. They don't come from the Middle East. They don't come from Brazil. Certainly don't come from Russia. They come from Canada. So we're not going to attack our primary supplier of oil.
Right, unless you want gas to be high as.
But those checks and balances don't exist in Russia.
Right. So I was going to ask this question. You were talking about essentially NATO and them not being able to do a lot because then that puts all options on the table. Kind of explain that a little bit, because for the layman, it's like, well, why is NATO not doing anything? We all see this thing happening. We all say this is terrible. Why aren't we going in to help?
Well, because Russia has nuclear weapons. If Afghanistan had nuclear weapons, we wouldn't have gotten in there either. Basically, so 1949, coming out of the ashes of World War II, the U.S. and a lot of countries in Europe, France, England, the rebuilding Germany, would be included in that group. The rebuilding Italy, Spain, Portugal, other, Belgium, the Netherlands, the other countries that, particularly the ones, Poland, that had borne the brunt of the damage and the fighting, not only in World War I, but then again in World War II, were hungry for some sort of security. And so what came of that in 1949 was NATO, the North American Treaty Organization, which basically agreed that, because if you think back to World War I, World War II, this thing happened in waves, right? I mean, Germany invades Poland in 1939, but it's not until almost 1942 that the U.S. gets involved after Japan attacks Pearl Harbor in December 7th, 1941, right?
Right.
So basically, they all kind of agreed, hey, we have common interests, we have shared goals in terms of wanting to support democracy, in terms of wanting to open up trade and make lives better and easier for people. And they basically just agreed. Article 5 of the NATO, Articles of Confederation and all that, basically says an attack on one is an attack on all. So if you're part of NATO and somebody attacks you, everyone else in NATO is bound by this treaty to support your military efforts. And it's not necessarily an offensive thing. It's 100%. It's designed to be defensive. It's designed to say, if someone invades your country, we will stand shoulder to shoulder with you and we will fight them back.
Okay.
And so if China were to attack the U.S., which is not going to happen either, again, for the same reasons the U.S. want to attack Canada. I mean, China, there's nobody who buys more crappy Chinese-made goods than the U.S. If the U.S. stopped buying everything China, their economy, which is also struggling a little bit, by the way, and is stagnated, would crumble to dust. China gains nothing by trying to attack California. But if that were to happen, then the 28 European countries would be bound by the NATO, pact that treaty would compel them to join us in the fight against China. And so it's a defensive alliance, military alliance, that basically says an attack on one is an attack on all. And so if the Ukraine were part of NATO and Russia attacked, we'd already be at war with Russia. And so that's part, and look, and that's part of why Putin doesn't want the Ukraine to be in NATO, right?
Right.
He doesn't want that. But it's also why Vladimir Putin is not going to go after Poland or Romania or Bulgaria, at least not yet. There are some scenarios that I think could force his hand, but we're nowhere near that yet. I mean, the reality is this is still, 5 days, as we're taping this, 5 days into the war. It might be 6. It's probably 6 now over there. There was a lot. I mean, neither side has unleashed their full capabilities yet. I mean, the Ukrainians have primarily in defense, but Russia has not played its hand. I mean, if you're thinking about this like a poker game, the cards have been dealt, and you're exchanging. Like if we aren't even to the the turn yet, or much less the river card. Like there were a lot of things that Russia could still do. At the same time, there were a lot of things that the Ukraine could do. Both sides have actually shown a degree of restraint so far.
It's so interesting that you use the term restraint because when we it's again, all the reports and things that have come out about this, it almost seems like we're on the fast track to World War III. And while I don't want to alarm anyone, much less myself, there are times where I'm like, is this it? Is this what we're doing now? Like,
well, so we don't understand the Russian people here in the U.S. We don't understand them. They probably understand us a little bit better just because the U.S.'s number one export is not wheat or grain or anything like that. It's culture. It's our movies. It's our music. It's things like that. So the rest of the world, to the degree that you can understand a people based just off of their movies, their music, their television, stuff like that.
Their media.
Yeah, their media, their books, things like that. The rest of the world has a different, sees the U.S. in a way that we don't, because the vast majority of people here in this country probably couldn't have told you that Kyiv was the capital of Ukraine until roughly last Thursday. That's not to say that there's no one here who could, but
I couldn't. I'm not gonna lie. I couldn't.
I would wager that 85 to 90% of people probably still couldn't pick the Ukraine out on a map today. And that's, it is what it is. That's a topic for another podcast about whether America is properly prepared for their citizens to be part of a global economy and things like that, because I think that the short and fast answer is no, we're not. But we don't understand the Russian people. I mean, like, we tend to think of so I was when I've been talking with experts on Russia and the Ukraine in the last couple of weeks, and I'll ask them, okay, so what's a timeline on this? Like, if the Ukraine resistance holds out for 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 2 months, like, what's it going to take for Vladimir Putin? He's like, listen, the Russian people don't look at time as a linear march the same way that we do here in the West. The best way to put it would be the Russians tend to look at time as more of a flat circle. Whatever is has already been and will be again. Like, so while we have this notion of one of the professors from William Jewell that I talked to about this described it this way. He said, well, we have this notion of carpe diem. Every day is important. Every day is precious, live in the present. Like, that's not what it is in Russia. Like, it's all just one big cycle. You're going to suffer. You're going to have, there's going to be days that are good. There's going to be days that you suffer. We're all going to die. It is what it is. The world keeps spinning. So they just don't see it that way. You're not going to pin Vladimir Putin down to a timeline because he just doesn't see it that way. So while we look at it in those terms, that's not going to be instructive as to what's actually going to happen with this war, because that's not how Vladimir Putin, that's not how the Russian people, and to a degree, that's not how the Ukrainian people view it.
Okay.
I think our lack of understanding of Russia and our just general lack of awareness about some things like that is causing a lot of people in this country to play catch up with like what's going on.
Absolutely, yeah.
But Vladimir Putin is notoriously hard for us to read and predict. I will say this: we can never have an Olympics in China or Russia again, ever, period. Because in August 2008, when the Summer Olympics were in Beijing, Vladimir Putin decided to use that as a pretext to invade Georgia. When Russia hosted the Winter Olympics in Sochi in 2014, they decided to invade the Ukraine and annex Crimea. And now the Olympics go back to China and he starts another war. We just can't. Causation, correlation is not causation, but it's not worth the risk. They're 3 for 3. Don't do it ever again. No more Olympics in China or Russia, because every time it happens, something terrible happens to people in the former Soviet Union.
Well, and I think
if you think back to 2008, when they invaded Georgia, and again, like I said earlier, it was under the same there were separatists who supposedly were being massacred by the government. Georgia's one of the most unique governments in the former Soviet Union, and they've been, frankly, one of the more successful governments that did not have some of the same hiccups that so many of the other former Soviet, post-Soviet states had after the everything broke up between 88 and 91. But Putin went in, and a lot of people did not think that he would actually invade, because Georgia's a member of the United Nations. And they just did not think that he would actively attack. And then he did. And a lot of people were like, well, didn't see that coming. And so then they just assumed he was just going to march on Tbilisi and just occupy the country, because it wouldn't be hard for the Russian army to. It would be much easier for the Russian army to occupy Georgia than it would be for them to occupy Ukraine. And then he stopped. Vladimir Putin stopped after taking over the territory, which he still controls. Russia still controls to this day. But he stopped. Again, everybody assumed he wouldn't do it. And then when he did it, they just assumed he'd finish the job. And he did neither of those things.
Do you think that part of the reason he didn't? Do you think that was his idea at that moment? And I don't want you just to put your head in Vladimir Putin.
There's no, I couldn't.
But do you think part of that was just that general show of strength that I could if I wanted to, but
No. I honestly think that Vladimir Putin believes that the Ukrainian government has been infiltrated by neo-Nazis and that they are actively purging ethnic Russians. I think he believes that. And the reason I think that he believes that is because of two factors. He is a ruthless dictator who will murder or imprison you for looking at him sideways or standing up in public and speaking out against him. He has shown that time and time again. And over time, the people around you, like when you threaten me to come on this podcast, Jason, increasingly I just say, yes, sir. What time do you need me, sir? Right? Over time, you understand the consequences of displeasing this man.
That is not how this goes.
No, Jason usually calls. He's like, "Can you do this?" And half the time I'm like, "I have stuff to do with my kids." But in the case of Vladimir Putin, people have seen over the last 20 plus years, like the consequences of not doing what he wants, of not doing his bidding. If you're his friend and you're willing to do his bidding, he will grant you a lot of latitude and a pretty darn good life. Like, there are lots of Russian oligarchs who are living it up in Miami most of the year, and they are having a grand old time. Floating around the Mediterranean Sea, during spring and summer, and just living their best life. Now, when Vladdy Daddy calls and says, "I need you to do this,"
they go do it.
Yeah, you say how high. He doesn't have to ask you to jump. You just immediately ask how high. And so that's kind of how Russia works. And so two things have happened. Ironically, the COVID-19 pandemic is part of this problem. He has isolated himself to avoid it. He has largely stayed away from the Kremlin. He had, and so the number of people who surround him, the number of people who can speak with him, the number of people who he relies on from counsel has narrowed considerably. And then on top of that, when you factor in that people don't want to displease him, there's a natural tendency, like over time, like if you see, someone told him this and he didn't like it, and now that guy like got sent to Siberia, right? Like I don't want to go to Siberia.
I want to go to Siberia, right?
Tell him that. Like I'm not telling him that. No. And so you tend to only tell him things that you think he wants to hear and that you think will please him. And now you've got an isolated man who has a savior complex, who's getting terrible intel and an inaccurate picture of what's happening. And I think he's made some pretty serious miscalculations. I think he really believed that that ethnic Russians were being murdered by the thousands by this, like neo-Nazi Ukrainian government. I honestly think that he believed that, or at least had convinced himself of that. It's not true. Are there neo-Nazis there? Well, yeah, there are neo-Nazis here. I mean, Charlottesville, Virginia was 2017, right? Like, there were people marching with Nazi insignia and, with their arms in the air, chanting "Hail Hitler" and other stuff. Like, so, yeah, there are people like that in the Ukraine too, especially in the parts that are very, very much like the South here, where where they are very much nationalistic. Yeah, I mean, that stuff exists. two of those candidates ran for president in 2019 when Zelensky, was elected, and they got collectively 2% of the vote. So it's a lot like here. They exist. Generally, they're on the fringes and they lose a lot of elections because they're fundamentally unelectable.
Okay.
But they exist.
So let me, and I hate to bring this in.
But they do not control the government. They are not in danger of coming to power in the government. For God's sake, Zelensky was a stand-up comedian who used to do sketches where he would play Nagila Hava with his junk on a piano to entertain people in primetime television in Ukraine. Go search it up. It's glorious. It is absolutely glorious. Now he's leading the resistance against Russia. But his grandfather fought in the Soviet army against the Nazis in World War II. He had relatives who died in the Holocaust. This man is not allowing neo-Nazi sympathizers and far-right wingists to run his government in some shadow conspiracy. It's not true. It never was true. Ukraine is actually one thing I hope people do, read up on the Ukraine. I mean, there's some good documentaries out there on Netflix. There's a lot of, good resources to get background that you'll see popping up about the Ukraine. They have an incredible history. They're a very, very tough, people. They supply most of Europe's grain and wheat and stuff. They're called the breadbasket of Europe because, they're kind of like the heartland, like they're Kansas, Missouri, Iowa, and Nebraska. They're very similar to kind of that hearty, but good-natured, help out your neighbor, but kind of tough but nice at the same time.
Right.
They're very much like that. And so it's a shame what's happening to those people right now.
So I hate to do this because I really, as much as I can not talk about this man, my life would be much better. But there is a lot of people that have said, especially on the social medias, that this wouldn't have happened if Trump got reelected. And I think that in my mind, I look at this and go, well, yeah, no, because it wouldn't have had to happen because we would have left NATO and Trump would have given him Ukraine on a silver platter. So it wouldn't have been this. But as someone who's more educated than me in these things, was this a timing thing, or because there is something to be said for he didn't try this shit during the Trump presidency,
Here's the reality. A lot of people honestly expected this to happen during the Trump administration because he had signaled that he was willing to walk away from NATO. He had signaled that because the whole point of a military alliance is a pretty bright line. An attack on one is an attack on all. Trump had sent a lot of pretty strong signals that if Russia had attacked, say, Estonia, he may not have sent U.S. troops to fight. He may not have sent U.S. weapons to fight that back. So a lot of people really thought that something like this could happen on any day during the Trump presidency. And Trump really did a lot to destabilize NATO in a lot of respects. And quite honestly, I don't think President Biden had done a whole hell of a lot to restore people's faith in it. You still got Boris Johnson, who's his own brand of crazy, and they're Brexiting and all that. There's still, it's not to say there's not conflict on the European continent, but there hadn't been military conflict. So I don't think Biden had done a lot to actively repair NATO relations. He'd certainly done more than Trump had because Trump was actively tearing them down. And so Biden had certainly signaled, no, we're with you. Don't worry. But I think a lot of NATO countries were just not having Trump in office settled them down because they knew that the treaty would be recognized by the U.S. in the event something happened.
Right.
I think there was actually more danger of not only something happening to Ukraine, but something happening to, say, Romania or something, or something like that, was much higher during the Trump administration because of his willingness to essentially walk away from NATO.
So why do you think that Trump did, or why do you think Trump or that Putin didn't do anything during that time period?
Well, okay, so you've got to think about the wider world, right? And so, I mean, Boris Johnson with the UK, 3-4 years ago, when he was leading them out of Brexit and had a pretty strong mandate in the UK.
Was it strong? Never mind. That's a different conversation for another day.
Well, I mean, he was elected and he was doing what the people wanted. So he certainly had more of a mandate than he has now. Now he's on the brink of being ousted by his own party. I mean, people are sick of him. Okay. Emmanuel Macron in France is facing re-election this spring. So he's at a point where he's fighting for his political life. He has to be a little bit careful about what steps he takes, especially in terms of potentially sending French soldiers into harm's way, right? The big one, though, Angela Merkel, who was, Prime Minister of Germany, she was a bad lady, all right? Didn't nobody want to cross Merkel? Merkel was... And
that bad isn't bad, but bad isn't good.
Yeah, no, she was a fucking... she was a hoss. She was the power broker, in my opinion, on the European continent. She's gone. You've got a new, chancellor there, prime minister there, who it was described to me as she's still trying to figure out where all the bathrooms are. So you've got these weak points. The U.S. also, Biden pulled up stakes in Afghanistan.
Didn't go well.
Well, it didn't, and I think Putin took that as a sign of. I think he took it as a sign that Biden was old, that Biden was weak, and that Biden could be pushed around. So when you have all that coming together, a weakened Germany, a weakened France, a weakened and divided U.S., and a weakened United Kingdom, seems like a good time to launch an offensive.
It's kind of the timing. The timing was just all there.
I mean, China's not going to stop us. They want to see what the international response is, so that if we want to. Maybe we want to invade Taiwan and take it back.
Because we've wanted Taiwan for a long time, and
what would NATO and other and what would allies do? Like, what would the response be? This is instructive to them. So China kind of wants to see it play out, and they're not going to condemn Vladimir Putin because there's a lot of money to be made if someone wants to do some really shady stuff in Russia right now. I mean. And there's some shady people in Beijing who may want to do that. You got to remember, Xi Jinping is a lot like Putin. I mean, he's the buck stops with him. He's the one guy who, makes decisions and decides the fate of the country, much like Vladimir Putin does for Russia.
So, I think that for me, my takeaway, and we're not anywhere near done. I mean. But my takeaway from just this part of the conversation is us as Americans really need to brush up on kind of geopolitical conversations and understand not necessarily at least have a working knowledge on what's happening, in other countries, especially since we are, we are a global economy now. We are a global we are globally connected. So what happens over there does affect things here.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, when it comes to health, when it comes to economics, when it comes to the environment, I think we have a greater understanding today that those things are all interconnected. COVID did not start here. It wrecked a lot of stuff here, but that did not come. The flu every year comes from the same region in China. I mean,
don't say that too loud. You know how people get.
Well, yeah, but that's just the reality. I mean, that's just the reality. The flu every year, is set through, the bird population in a particular region of China. That's how they choose to base what the from my understanding, what the yearly influenza shot is going to be is based on, whatever the dominant strain of flu that's coming out is. I mean, it is a reality. Americans are very insular. They tend to think about the U.S. and only the U.S. And for a lot of people, they tend to think about their own bank account and only their own bank account. They don't really think about much beyond that. And I think that's how you get in a situation where we're in, where our own version of a sycophant who can scream and point and tell you that it's this person's fault, and I'm going to take care of that person can win a popular election in this country. I to me, it was a shameful 4 years. And I think it did a lot of damage to the standing of the U.S. And like I will say this, Biden mangled the Afghanistan situation. I mean, that just is what it is. Like, that's the problem. It's not.
No, what I mean is what I mean by it, but is that I agree with you. That just like
it was an utter failure of leadership.
Yes,
it was an utter failure of leadership. You have to always, and as a leader, especially when other people's lives are in your hands, prepare for the worst, hope for the best. It seems like they hoped for the best and prepared for the best. And then when stuff hit the fan, they didn't know what to do. They didn't know what to do. And they utterly failed in that moment. And I mean, Putin saw that, just like the rest of us saw that. It was an abject failure. There's no other way to characterize it. There's no spin you can put on it. It was a complete and utter lack of leadership and a complete and utter failure. I will say he has done a far better job from a diplomatic standpoint handling this Ukraine situation.
Do you think it's because he learned?
No.
Okay.
I think there were a lot of people who were over Afghanistan. It was a losing proposition from the beginning. We learned the same lesson that the Russians learned in the 70s.
To lead like that Afghanistan is not winnable.
You can't. I mean, you can't. It was the same miscalculation that Putin is making in Ukraine. Like, we thought we would be welcomed as liberators, like freeing you from the tyranny of these terrorists. They didn't want us there. They don't want us there. And they would just assume we go away and leave them alone. That's what Ukraine is telling Vladimir Putin right now. We don't want you here. We don't need you here. Go home, Vlad. And I think it's a shock to his system. There are heads rolling in Vladimir Putin's inner circle right now. There's reports coming out that Vladimir Putin is lashing out in anger here and there, which is very against his nature. He's a former KGB agent. And much like if you call someone a former Marine and they will tell you there's no such thing as a former Marine, Vladimir Putin will tell you there's no such thing as a former KGB agent. He is very guarded. He is very sharp. And he is very cunning and utterly ruthless. That's who he is. You don't stay in power in a country like Russia as long as he has as the power broker in that country without being all of those things.
He's been, and to be fair, he's been in power in some way, shape, or form for 26 years now.
Yeah, a quarter century or more. Yeah, and I mean, he's a powerful adversary, and he's got nuclear weapons, and he is not someone to trifle with. Having said that, go back to the conversation about getting bad information and stuff like that. When you are the only one getting that information, you've isolated yourself, you've sounded yourself with yes men who won't paint an accurate picture for you. Look, the war's not going as well as they'd hoped. They're facing a lot more resistance. The worldwide sanctions are far greater than they expected and have come far swifter than they expected, I think. No pun intended, but I don't think they expected to be booted out swift as quickly as they were. I think he's realizing that the situation in Ukraine is not matching up with what he had been told the situation in Ukraine was. And I think he's confused. I think he's angry. And that, to me, that's where the greater danger lies. I think Vladimir Putin would have been happy to roll into Kiev, eliminate Zelensky and anyone who would support him and could lead an uprising, and then pull back, occupy the Donbas region, the Luhansk and Donetsk. Maybe he wanted to have a land bridge down to Crimea so that he didn't have to take ships to get down there. Maybe so he could just roll down there on his own if he wanted to. Maybe they want to, maybe that means taking over part of Odessa, but Odessa's farther west and it gets a little bit dicey. You go that way, but I mean, there's probably a range of objectives he had in mind. But I think he would have been happy with regime change and occupation of eastern Ukraine at the end of the day. And I think that he thought those were objectives that he could roll in a week without a problem. And that has not happened. And
right.
That will not happen.
Because they are not, because and one thing I will say about the Ukrainian people that I have seen is, you said, you mentioned earlier that they're tough and they're kind and they are not playing around. Like,
no, but I mean, if in Donald Trump's America, he had declared war on Kansas and Missouri, and they were coming for us, like aiming to destroy us and wipe us off the map. I mean, what would you do to remain free?
I mean, yeah, I get that, but also it would be a situation where even the people that are normally his supporters, the ethnic Russians in the area who did have affinity for Vladimir Putin are like, whoa, what is happening here? This is too far. We don't want this.
Right. Well, it's because, much like, I mean, if you're in Iowa and the U.S. decides that they're going to attack Kansas, you're probably like, hey, what? I mean, that could be us, man. Like, that those people are just like, what are you doing? Stop it, dummy. Stop it, man. Like, we don't want this. This isn't what we want. What are you doing?
I honestly think that
I mean, that's look, the reality is, and I've never been to Russia or the Ukraine, but I have been to France and England. The reality is, and I traveled mostly alone by myself in my early 20s. It was only about for a couple weeks, but I don't speak French. Still don't speak French. Like I knew enough to say I don't speak. Je ne parle pas français. No. Je ne parle pas français. Parlez-vous anglais? I knew enough to say I don't speak French. Do you speak English? And then after that I was just at the mercy of other the people, the great people of Paris. The people I encountered there, they want to have a job. They hope it has meaning. They want to have they have dreams. Own a house, start a business. Paint, play golf, learn to play golf, whatever. They want to have a relationship, they want to have kids, and they want those kids to be able to give those kids a better life than the one they were afforded.
Right.
That's true here. That's true in France. That's true in England. That's true in Ukraine. That's true in Russia. That's true in China. That's true everywhere for the people who live in those countries. The vast majority of the 8 billion people on this planet, that's what they want. They want to peacefully coexist with those around them. They hope to find love. They hope to find something that fulfills them and allows them to feel like they're making good use of their days. And if they choose to have children, they want those children to be happy, to be healthy, and to go on to see their own dreams, which they hope are even greater than theirs, realized. That's true of everybody. And the people in Russia who feel that way, they don't want the Russian economy to be ground to powder and for them to suffer because Vladimir Putin is scared about his legacy and is worried that Ukraine is becoming too aligned with Western Europe and has now drifted outside of the sphere of influence of Russia. He wants to keep Ukraine under his boot.
But
that's what it is. That's what it is.
And it's so interesting because when as you're talking about, I'm like, that's the same thing that everybody essentially wants, but then you look at, or I look at what's happening in Ukraine, and you mentioned earlier that, like, if somebody came, if Donald Trump had declared war in Kansas and Missouri, what would you do? Well, I think part of the problem is if he had done that here, like, I don't think that the majority of, maybe in the city there would be resistance, but out in the country they would be like, they'd be coming here to fight us. You know what I mean? Whereas,
no. I mean, it's an imperfect analogy because like Kansas and Missouri would be the Ukraine in that situation. We don't want Trump's rule. Like, are there people who would be sympathetic to him? There might be a few, but by and large, those people, they Ukraine. No, your lack of understanding of the Ukrainian and the Russian people is at play here. You're thinking that Ukraine and Russia are 50-50 and and that it's all, it's conservatives against Democrats. It's not. It's just not.
But see, the thing is I'm not even looking at it from a conservative against Democrats.
Well, yeah, you are, because you're saying the rural Trump.
No, because see, I'm looking at Trump voters or the people who hold Trump on that pedestal. I'm not looking at them in terms of Democrat or Republican.
Well, but the people in the, I mean.
Again, like what I was saying is that
the Donbas region has already been an occupied territory since 2014. That separatist movement has already existed.
Right, but what I'm saying is, but even those people that are in the separatist movement are like, we don't want this.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. Is it'd be the same thing. The people in rural, that would be the equivalent to the people in rural Missouri and rural Kansas saying, Bro, we like you, fine, but this is not what we want. Don't like tear apart our country. What are you doing, man? That's what's happening.
Okay. Conley says, what about the Tucker Carlsons of the world? Listen, we don't have time for Tucker Carlson. I mean, he's his own. But that's a good point. Part of the reason that we, I feel like there is this kind of disconnect from, especially in the U.S., of like what's happening over in the Ukraine is that the way that we're getting our media. You know what I mean? It's listening in these echo chambers.
Right, but that's a choice, though. I mean, Reuters exists. The BBC exists. Like, you can go to BBC and get information about any part of the world, scan their headlines, whatever. Reuters has incredible journalism. I mean, there's that stuff is out there. I mean, people tend to be tribalistic about it. I mean,
right, I agree with you. I too enjoy Reuters and the Associated Press and all of those things. But I think that when one side has convinced, when one side has been convinced that mainstream media is lying to them, then you have places for the Tucker Carlsons and the give me another name, I'm sure you know it. Sean Hannity's, and even on the left,
Rachel Maddow.
Listen, I love Rachel, but I get it's still an echo chamber.
Yeah, it is, and I make that complaint all the time. I mean, if you only ever listen to MSNBC and then you complain about Fox News, well, it's a little 10-eared argument in my opinion.
Although I will say that I get that they do have their skews and their spins, but as far as credible news sources, I do trust MSNBC more than I trust Fox News.
Well, and that's because they don't have a history of just telling you outright lies. I mean, I think education is the only answer. The reality is that the U.S. is an uneducated, isolated.
We about to get letters. Go ahead.
And largely ignorant population. We just are. We are. And that's, I mean, look, it's actually not, it's not an indictment of the U.S. It's actually in a strange way indicative of how successful the U.S. has been. We have the it's, okay, I'm going to put it in a way that you will understand, okay? The U.S. is white America. we have the privilege of not caring what happens in the rest of the world. We have the privilege of not caring what other languages are spoken anywhere else. Because if China was the one putting out all the movies and all the music, we would all have to know Chinese so we could enjoy a movie without having to read. Because we don't want to read in this country. Okay? There is a degree of privilege that exists being in the US. Not to say that we don't have our problems, but the very fact that you and I can sit here and have this conversation on Zoom, and I can pretty much go eat whatever the hell I want. I can go wherever I want and buy whatever I want. I can pretty much, after we finish doing this, go do whatever I please for the rest of the night. Now there's some restrictions that, I mean, if I drink and drive, or if I go, attack someone or something like that, I mean, obviously we've agreed that, I should face some consequences, whatever. But we have the privilege in this country because of how much we have that, I mean, I'm not sure that people in this country understand what third world poverty is. And we just don't have the same frame of reference for that. And that's not to minimize the problems that we have in this country, because they are many and they are varied. And whether you're talking about police brutality and police killing killing unarmed black men, or police officers being allowed to stay out on bond when they don't let other people, do that, as is happening with the police officer who killed Cameron Lamb, or whether you're talking about the opioid epidemic, which affects a different swath of the country. I mean, the U.S. certainly has problems, but we also, because of the privilege that is afforded us being in this country. I mean, because look, you and I both have relatively modest houses, right?
Right. But, well, I haven't seen your house. I don't know.
But trust me, it's a split level. It's split level in suburbia, built in the '70s. It's a modest, single family structure. Relative to the rest of the world, we live in palaces, dude. Like, right. I mean, and so I don't think most people in the U.S. understand that. Our frame of reference is skewed just by being U.S. citizens.
U.S. citizens. No, I completely understand. That I do get.
Right. And so, but because of that, because like all our needs are taken care of for the most part, not for everybody. Obviously there are people who, are housing insecure. There are people who are food insecure. I get that. But the vast majority of us, our basic needs are met. Like, we're pretty high up on Maslow's hierarchy in terms of, when we're picking steak or salmon for dinner, like, okay, like, come on, man. Like there's a reason we call it first world problems.
Right.
So it's a sign of privilege that we don't have to care about the rest of the world. But I think what we're seeing is, with the internet, with the globalization of labor, of trade, of everything, I think we're seeing how interconnected we all are at the end of the day. And I think people are starting to wake up to the fact that you have to be a better and more informed citizen of the world. If you listen to MSNBC or you read Reuters, if you just listen to Fox News, they're just going to continue to tell you that anyone, that everyone is trying to get you. Everyone is out to get you. And here are the people you should be mad at today, because these are the people that are making you pay more for gas. And Biden's an utter failure. Like, I talk to politicians all the time, and there's a couple of them that I've quit accepting their interview requests, because anything I ask them, it's failed Joe Biden policy, this failed, and and I'm like, come on, man.
I didn't ask you all that, right? Like,
as well as I do that Joe Biden has as much to do with the supply chain problems we're experiencing as you and I do. Like, but whatever. Like, so, I mean, look, that's a problem, but I don't think Fox News is the reason people don't know what's going on in the Ukraine, or who couldn't, who don't know who Emmanuel Macron is.
I agree with you to a point, but
now people are idiots. Don't let them off the hook. People are idiots.
Yeah. Okay. So let's take I got a couple of comments in there from the YouTube. Kali says, "What about?"
I didn't know this is being streamed live. Now, yeah, we are going to get
louder. Kali said, "What about the countries that abstained from the UN votes, like the United Arab Emirates, China, and India?" I'm not quite sure.
I have no idea what India. I don't know.
I don't know what vote she's talking about. But then she said again.
So the UN Security Council had a resolution to condemn the Russian invasion, and Russia has veto power. So I believe the final tally was 11-1 to 3, with 11 voted to condemn Russia. Russia vetoed it, so it didn't. It carried no weight. And then United Arab Emirates, India, and China abstained. I mean, China, like I said, China's in a wait and see mode. China, everybody has this friend, right? Everybody has this friend that you can count on them to only ever do whatever is their own in their own best interest. And so one day that may be one thing, and the next day it may be completely different. So China felt like it was in their best interest to wait and see. Like, we're not going to pick sides here just yet. Like,
kind of see which way the wind is blowing.
We may want Russia to abstain when we invade Taiwan, okay? We may want Russian banks to keep propping up the yen and keep giving us natural gas and oil if we decide to invade Taiwan one day and the rest of the world imposes these types of sanctions. China hates sanctions because China's already pretty isolated. And like I said, Xi Jinping has done a pretty good job of further isolating them politically because he's angered everyone else on the Asian subcontinent for the most part, except North Korea. And if North Korea is the only neighbor that likes you, you are not in good company.
My nightmare scenario, I'm going to be honest with you, with this whole thing is the idea, like, because I look at things in, me, how can this all go terribly wrong?
I could tell you I can tell you some of those scenarios.
And
as far as India and the United Arab Emirates, though, like I don't know enough about the politics of why those India baffled me. Like, that one I didn't get at all. United Arab Emirates, I mean, Russia has some deep ties to to the Middle East. I mean, again, we talked about the restraint that Vladimir Putin had shown in Georgia before, and has so far shown in the Ukraine.
Now that you said that, we're going to wake up to some shit going down.
What I mean by that is, think back to the late 90s when Chechnya decided that they wanted their independence, right? And Russia was like, you cannot have your independence.
you would like what, please? No.
And so, the Chechens tried to fight them and fight for their independence, kind of like the Ukrainians are doing today. And the response was that they just leveled Grozny. I mean, they just lobbed rockets and just blew that place to hell and back. Like,
you want your independence? You get nothing.
Apartment building, they did not care. They blew it. They leveled it all. They absolutely leveled it all. They've not done that in Kiev or in Kyiv. They have not done that in Kharkiv. They have not done that in Odessa. They could, but they have not yet. They also have only sent in about half of their 150,000 troops so far. So they have not done that yet. There are, they have not, I mean, Belarus apparently is going to now join the fight. They have not started, sending rockets. At the same time, Russia built a bridge from Crimea to the Ukrainian mainland, to help, probably with the idea at some point that, they want that land bridge to the Donbas region from there. And Russian troops are coming up from the south and attacking the south. It's not getting as much attention a lot of people are focused on Kyiv right now, but they're coming up from Crimea. Russian forces that are assembled there. Ukraine could blow that bridge, man. I mean, there are some cities in southern Russia that Ukraine has medium range rockets. If they wanted to target Russian cities, and we're talking cities with a couple million people, and if they wanted to attack, like bomb with short, medium range missiles, the equivalent of southern Russia's Kansas City, they could do it. They could 100% do it. If the Ukraine wanted to start carrying out terrorist attacks in Moscow and St. Petersburg, I mean, they've got a secret service. Ukrainians can blend in with Russians very, very easily. They all speak Russian. They look like them. If they wanted to start, I mean, they do. If they want to start bombing subways and planting bombs, like, there's a lot of things the Ukrainians could still do and a lot of things the Russians could still do. So when I say that they're showing a little bit of restraint, that's what I mean is that there are more damaging options that are still being held in reserve at this point. Like that's what I mean when I say the cards aren't all on the table. What gets scary is actually if the Ukrainians succeed, kind of. Actually.
Okay, so we're gonna get to that in a second because that's good. We're gonna end on that. Like what happens if the
right.
But I was talking about the North Korean quotient because here's the thing: I am a firm believer in the idea of my enemy. Politically, my enemy, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and we
unless you're China, like I said, unless you're China, and then it depends on the day.
It depends on the day. And what are the and if we're talking World War III scenario, this idea that we get a Russian North Korean alliance.
Well, if we get to that, it's going to be over pretty quick. There's just going to be a lot of glowing, burning cities all over the globe if it really comes to that. Probably. I mean,
okay. If
That's
that happens, get in your bunker.
Right. Honestly, like if if the U.S. response had been boots on the ground immediately in the Ukraine, like he might have lobbed a nuke at Paris. He really might have, or something. He might have. And there are worst case scenarios that people legitimately are concerned that kind of thing is still on the table.
Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about what happens if the Ukraine wins this. If they back him into a corner.
Well, I mean, he's being backed into a corner already, and the longer this drags out, I think if this drags into the summer, and Ukraine is still mounting successful resistance. Zelensky has still been able to run the government, and maintain the seat of power in the Ukraine, and they have not been able to capture, kill, or exile him. And the Ukrainian government is still functioning. I mean, one thing you have to understand is authoritarian dictators take power by force, and that's generally the only thing that will get an authoritarian dictator to leave. It's the language they speak. And as long as that authoritarian dictator can flex and win, that's fine. But, when you're the heavyweight champ and you're undefeated, life is good. The minute Buster Douglas knocks you down, though, man, like, people are going to start coming for you. I mean, just like what happened with Mike Tyson. Like, there was a time Mike Tyson was the baddest dude on the planet. Then Buster Douglas catches his chin. You lose on the battlefield as an authoritarian dictator, and, all bets are off. And that is the number one way to lose control of your regime and ultimately lose your own head, is to get your butt beat on the battlefield. And so the longer this drags out, the more that Putin feels like this is what's happening, the more he will get backed into that corner. And the more he gets backed into that corner, the more dangerous and unpredictable he becomes, because we don't know what the hell he's going to do anyway. And here's the truth of the matter is, I don't think Vladimir Putin knows what he's going to do. And so, you know, I don't think that he ever envisioned a scenario when he would face as much resistance as he has already in the Ukraine. And the longer that drags out, I mean, the question becomes, at what point, if he tucks tail and runs, he's finished, right? Like, no, I mean,
nobody's gonna take him seriously anymore.
Right. If he does that, he has shown weakness. And now the chances that the Russian people will no longer support him, and the chances that a successful opposition can be mounted to depose him, whether by military coup or some other means, have grown exponentially. So at some point, if Putin begins to think, I have to win at all costs, then what does he think it will take to win? Does that mean attacking NATO? Does that mean, you know, launching nuclear? I mean, I don't know. And I like I said, I don't even think Putin knows at this point. You know, I mean, maybe it'll be like Georgia. Maybe he'll be content to, you know, pull back in a couple weeks and say, our peacekeeping mission in the Donbas region was a success. We have secured, you know, Luhansk and Donetsk. But then the problem is, I mean, you left neo-Nazis in charge of the Ukrainian government, right? So he's backed himself into a corner in some respects. And the question is, what's going to get him out of it? The more interesting question to me is what could have been done to prevent it. I mean, if they had promised Ukraine won't be allowed to join NATO for at least 20 years, would that have been enough? Like a 20-year guarantee. We won't even consider them for NATO membership for 20 years. Because he's probably gone by then. It's someone else's problem. Is that enough? Does he feel like that secures his legacy? I don't know. I mean, he wanted binding permanent agreements that said Ukraine will never be allowed into NATO. And the rest of NATO was like, yeah, bro, I don't think we're doing that. Like,
well, and here's the thing. Like, I honestly, looking at this, I don't know how we navigate. I don't know, and maybe because we're in it, I don't know a way that this does not happen. You know, once he took Crimea, this was a matter of time.
Right. No, I mean, and that's what, yeah, the sanctions have been in place since 2014. This has always been part of his strategy to keep leverage. I mean, taking Crimea was strategic because it prevented NATO from accepting Ukraine. But I mean, basically, when it comes to major issues of security, you know, major decisions that are made in that region, he wants veto power. And to do that, he needs Belarus and Ukraine on board. And what he sees is a Ukraine that increasingly is not on board, and he is willing to do. He has chosen violence in trying to change that. You know, so he doesn't have a lot of. It reminds me in a weird way of, if you remember back, probably 2001.
I don't.
Right. George W. Bush was president, and a U.S. reconnaissance plane with some pretty sensitive, we'll call it spy equipment, was downed and landed in China. Like experienced trouble and had to emergency land.
I do remember this. Okay.
And occupied China. Okay. And ultimately, George W. Bush mismanaged the whole thing. It could have been done very diplomatically and very quietly and very easily. Instead, it was done very much out in the open. But the nice thing is, it gives me this little anecdote, because saving face in China is very important, right? I mean, it's a very prim and proper culture from an etiquette standpoint, especially when you're talking about power dynamics. And when it all happened, Bush got all cowboy with them, making demands publicly, this and that. And of course, China, they run a trade mission. Most of the diplomats run a trade mission in Brazil. They didn't even come back. They basically just told Bush, they were like, yeah, this is what we think you're.
China don't play that shit.
Yeah, they were like, no, F you. So ultimately what China wanted was they wanted a week with the U.S. planes so they could pilfer it for technology, right? Like, they were never going to kill the American soldiers. They were always going to release them at some point. They wanted time with the plane so they could get their engineers down there, take it apart, study it, figure out, what they could from the technology so that it could help them with their own surveillance, with their own aeronautics, with their own, military industrial complex. That's what they wanted. And Bush could have very quietly back-channeled for the immediate release of the U.S. soldiers and then, cowboyed up about it, and then hoped that no one really asked questions about what happened to the plane, and then had an agreement where a week later the U.S. quietly takes back the plane after the Chinese have done their autopsy of it, right? Instead, Bush made a big deal about it, and and it played out publicly. It played out very publicly. Like, the Chinese made a big thing about not releasing them, and the soldiers presumably had to stay locked up for far longer than they would have if it had just been done through some back channels. There are always in politics and diplomacy back channels that can be worked. Can someone get to Putin and convince him that he's made a grave error here? And can he swallow his pride enough? And does that still allow him to maintain power? Or does that allow him to still feel like he has the power? That I don't know. I think they will try before it gets to a nuclear war. And I will also say this. Everybody's scared about what Putin will do. But like I said, Putin is a calculated man. All right? I don't think he's going to tweet that we're nuking Paris tomorrow morning. That's not a danger to me. That he's going to, that you're going to have some Trumpian thing where he's going to be like, I'm creating Space Force. And it's like, what? Where did that even come from, man? Did you just watch Star Wars last night? What in the hell?
That's exactly where it came from.
What? It was Empire. This is TNT's fault. TNT had Empire Strikes Back on last night. Somebody changed the channel off Fox News, and he was like, I want a galactic warship. And then he tweets he's going to start Space Force. You don't have to worry about that with Vladimir Putin. That is not how this is going to go down. The reality is he wrote a 20-page term paper that was published on the Kremlin website in July that outlined everything he has said about Ukraine, about how they are our people. It was a mistake. We have a shared history. They are in fact Russian. They should always have been Russian. There are neo-Nazis. One of the ones that he keeps bringing up, there were clashes between separatist forces and pro-government factions in Odessa, which is on the Black Sea. It's in southern Ukraine. And several years ago, there was an incident where these forces were fighting, and a bunch of people had retreated into an office building. 40 pro-Russian separatists, and they were, fighting from an elevated position at these other, at these pro-Ukrainian separatists, and either somebody set the building on fire, or during the course of the fight, part of the building caught on fire, and 40, these 40 pro-Russian separatists died in the blaze. Now, there were some people who, when they realized what was happening, tried to run in and save them. But if there's a burning building, there's going to be a couple of those guys. The rest of them are going to stand around and watch the building burn.
I ain't got shit to do with this.
I'm going in there. So that's the reality of what happened. Like both sides were shooting each other. It was a clash, and it was a tragedy. To hear Vladimir Putin tell it, it was pro-Ukrainian neo-Nazi forces wearing swastikas and marching in the streets, and they chased these poor innocent pro-Russians. They were just embassy workers. They weren't doing anything. He ignores the fact that they actively shot back. And there's been several investigations into this, both by international people and within Ukraine. And he ignores the fact that this was a skirmish and a tragedy. And he claims that neo-Nazi forces forced 40 peaceful Russian workers into a building just because they were Russian, set the building on fire, and wouldn't let them get out. And this is one of the things he uses as his justification, as his proof. This is really the only proof he's ever presented that neo-Nazi forces have infiltrated the Ukrainian government and are in fact running it. Now, this happened in Odessa, I want to say 2014 or 2015. This was during like the Orange Revolution and some of the other incidents that happened that led to the Donbass being kind of an independent, it's honestly considered occupied territory at this point, or a chunk of it is anyway. But to me, it's a lot like the January 6th insurrection. Like
I was
there's
just
the reality
that
of what we all saw on television.
It's not matching
and then
what they say.
There's the reality that Tucker Carlson wants. He doesn't want you to believe your own eyes, and that's the same thing. Putin believes that this is what happened. It's not what happened, and it's not the reality of what's going on in Ukraine. But he believes it, and there's no one to tell him otherwise. So. But he's got a problem, because if he admits that he made this grave of an error and just got 3,000 or 4,000 Russians killed because he was reading Breitbart, I mean, if you're a Russian oligarch, how are you going to take, dude, turn off OAN network, man. What are we doing?
Right.
You're not going to take that well, which is why, the only thing more dangerous than a cornered dog is a cornered and beaten dog. And we get 4 to 6 months out, if the Russian economy is pulverized and the Ukrainian army is still winning, and there's hundreds of thousands of people in the streets, protesting against this, not only in Ukraine, but also in Moscow. I mean, look, that's going to have an impact on his troops. If you're the Russian military, because he sent that 5,000, 7,000 page essay that explained everything about why he's, so irredentist toward the Ukraine, to all of the Russian military. So they've all been indoctrinated with this propaganda of his. So it's reasonable to believe that most of them, to a degree, believe in the mission that they're serving here, because this is what they've been told. If 4 to 6 months later, these people are still fighting you, still killing you, you've still got grandmas throwing Molotov cocktails out of their car as they pass you by, and you see no evidence of this neo-Nazi conspiracy, and and there are people in the streets saying, "Go home, baby killer, go home." It's going to become a problem from a morale standpoint as well. I think you would start to see some defections from the Russian military. I think you'd start to see them lose faith in the cause and what they're fighting for. And on top of that, everything that gets blown up today, Russia can't replace with the same quality, because Taiwan and Japan and places like that have, because of the sanctions, are not going to send them the materials they need to rebuild everything. They're going to have to rely on cheaply made Russian and Chinese versions of it. But that also has a danger, because now, will your guidance system work properly when you're targeting, a makeshift airfield near Kiev, or are you going to hit the college? Everything comes with a cost.
So on a scale of 1 to, hey, there are bunkers on sale, let's go get one, how scared should we be?
Well, I can't speak for you or anyone else. I'm at a 2, because like I said, Putin is difficult to understand because we don't understand the Russian people very well. But he is not a cavalier man. He knows if he resorts to nuclear weapons, because you lob a nuke at Paris, France has nukes too, man. One's coming back at Moscow, and it's probably not stopping there, right?
And that's and once one person sees the nukes go, it's mutually assured destruction.
It's probably not going to be an eye for an eye. It's probably going to be worse than that. So you've got a man who's trying to secure his legacy when it comes to the Slavic people, the Slavic People's Union. And does he want to see that literally go up in a nuclear flame? Because it would. Because he will get blamed for this. And I think he knows if it comes to that, history will judge him as the person who pushed it to this point. Now, if he prevails, then I think, he can write the history book however he wants. The problem is, I think he knows, just like we know, there are no winners if we get to a nuclear war.
Right.
No one wins. It's at the very best, it's a completely hollow victory.
Mutually assured destruction is real.
Correct. And so, do I think he wants that? Do I think no. Do I think he's capable of that? A beaten cornered dog is capable of just about anything, man. So I'm not going to rule it out, but I'm not sitting here, like buying 8 extra cans of green bean and corn when I go and stashing them in my garage just in case.
We're not quite at Fallout yet.
We're nowhere near there yet. I mean, like I said, there would have to be some movement in a lot of other fronts. I mean, frankly, the Soviet army isn't even big enough right now. Like, they couldn't be an occupying force in Europe if they wanted to. So, I mean, invasion, like, there's a big difference between invasion and occupation. I'm not even convinced that the Russian army could occupy Ukraine, because I think what Ukraine's going to do is turn this into a guerrilla war. They don't have mountains like Afghanistan does, but they have cities, and cities that they know better than the Russians. And they can really be a pain in the Russian military's ass for a long, long time. So unless he can get in there soon and get rid of Zelensky, he's going to have to try to find a ripcord that he's comfortable with. And I don't know, and frankly, I don't think anybody can answer. Does that exist, and what would it be?
Okay, well, Todd, thank you so much for this. I think that you have explained a lot of this super complicated, high level. Oh my God, are we gonna die?
Not
stuff.
Not tonight, Jayson.
In a way that makes sense for me, which I'm dumb as shit. So if it makes sense for me, I'm sure that the people who
give yourself some credit. I mean, I'm an idiot too, so.
You got this. I mean, thank you so much.
I just talk to and read the words of people who are way smarter than me on this. So
well, and you're able to tell them to us. And so, if anything else happens or it goes, things go left again, or there's another turn, I'm gonna definitely be like, Todd, we gotta do another show. We gotta do another special report, because what is happening? But I really, really appreciate it. Guys, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want to get more more shows, things that are happening. Yes.
One thing I did want to point out, there's a best case scenario here too.
What's the best case scenario? Because
everybody likes to talk doom and gloom, but let's leave them with a positive note, okay?
What you got?
The best case scenario is the Ukrainians hold out, and the Russian people, tired of sanctions and not eager to go back to the days of Soviet breadlines, rise up and overthrow Putin.
Which then causes him to nuke his own people because he can't deal with... See, I'm going to find a way to take it bad.
I don't think he would. The question then becomes, does somebody even worse take power? or can the Russian people, demand democracy and everything changes? I mean, there is a version of this where the Russian people get sick of it and they rise up and they create a new destiny for them, and they manifest a new destiny for themselves.
I would love for that to be the case, but we're living in the worst timeline.
Right. Well, Troy shouldn't have gone to get the pizza.
So thank you so much, Todd. This has been great and fun, and we will definitely be doing this again. Thank you guys for watching this KCAPC special report. What the hell is going on in the Ukraine? We will be back to our regularly scheduled programming tomorrow with the Cousins at 5 and then Adventure University at 8:30. Thank you guys. Mwah. Good night.